The morning of December 15th, 1941, dawned with a bone-piercing cold that made the air itself seem brittle as Obergefreiter Hans Müller crouched in a snow-filled trench 30 kilometers west of Moscow, watching his breath freeze into ice crystals before it could dissipate. The temperature had plummeted to -38 degrees Celsius, and Müller's standard-issue leather boots felt like blocks of ice welded to his feet. What the German High Command had assured would be a swift summer campaign was now entering its 6th month, with winter gear that had never arrived and boots designed for the temperate climates of Western Europe. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Müller and his comrades would discover in the coming hours would shatter their faith not just in their equipment, but in the entire industrial philosophy that had sent them into this frozen wasteland unprepared. Müller flexed his toes inside his leather boots, trying to restore circulation that had been absent for the past 4 hours. The standard German army boot, crafted from quality leather with metal studs for traction, had served adequately in France and Poland. But here, in the Russian winter that seemed to mock the very concept of human survival, these same boots had become instruments of slow torture. The leather had stiffened into an unyielding shell. The metal studs conducted cold like tiny conductors of frostbite, and the narrow design compressed feet, already swollen from the constant cold. To his left, Gefreiter Otto Richter methodically removed his boots for the 3rd time that morning, revealing toes that had turned an alarming shade of blue-white. Richter, a cobbler from Bavaria in civilian life, examined his feet with the professional eye of someone who understood footwear. "Look at this design," Richter muttered, holding up his boot with disgust. "Leather sole, metal reinforcement, tight fit, perfect for a parade ground in Munich. Absolute catastrophe for anything below freezing." Further down the trench, Obergefreiter Klaus Weber hugged his knees to his chest, his entire body shaking uncontrollably, despite the wool uniform that was supposed to protect him. Weber had been writing detailed letters to his wife in Hamburg, documenting the inadequacies of their equipment with the methodical precision of the engineer he had been before the conflict. "The Russians are better equipped than we are," Weber had written in his most recent letter, though he had not yet sent it. "Their soldiers move across the snow like it is summer ground, while we struggle to take each step without falling." What Weber did not yet know was that his observation would soon be proven in the most dramatic way possible. The sound of approaching footsteps crunching through snow announced the arrival of Feldwebel Ernst Hoffmann, their section leader, who had been conducting morning reconnaissance along their defensive line. Hoffmann's face bore the wind-burned complexion of a man who had spent too many hours exposed to the Russian winter, and his eyes held a mixture of resignation and growing concern. "Gather around," Hoffmann called softly, his voice barely above a whisper to avoid carrying to enemy positions. "We have a situation that requires immediate attention." The men clustered together in the narrow trench, their collective body heat creating a small pocket of relative warmth in the Arctic air. Hoffmann gestured toward a section of no man's land, visible through the trench periscope, where the bodies of Soviet soldiers lay scattered from the previous day's skirmish. "Command wants us to conduct a reconnaissance patrol to gather intelligence on enemy equipment and positions," Hoffmann explained. "But there is something else, something I observed that you all need to see for yourselves." Müller exchanged glances with his comrades, wondering what their Feldwebel had discovered that warranted such mysterious language. They had all seen enemy equipment before, had examined captured weapons and supplies, but there was something in Hoffmann's tone that suggested this reconnaissance would reveal something far more significant than routine intelligence gathering. As they prepared for the patrol, Fehler noticed how each man struggled with the simple task of securing his equipment. Their fingers, stiff from cold despite woolen gloves, fumbled with buckles and straps that should have been second nature to experienced soldiers. Richter winced visibly as he forced his swollen feet back into the leather boots that had become instruments of slow agony. The patrol moved out just after 1000 hours, following a route that would take them through a section of forest where Soviet forces had established temporary positions. The snow here lay 3 feet deep, and with each step, the German soldiers sank nearly to their knees. Their leather boots, already inadequate for the cold, now became actively dangerous as snow packed around the metal studs and created slippery ice formations that made every footstep treacherous. Weber, despite his engineering background and natural problem-solving abilities, found himself slipping repeatedly as his boots failed to find purchase on the icy ground beneath the snow. Each fall sent sharp pains through his feet, where frostbite had already begun its insidious work. "How do the Russians move so efficiently in these conditions?" Weber asked, breathing heavily from the exertion of walking through snow that seemed designed to trap and exhaust them. The answer came sooner than any of them expected. As they approached the area where Soviet forces had been positioned, Hoffman raised his hand to signal a halt. Through the sparse winter trees, they could see the aftermath of the previous day's engagement. Soviet soldiers lay where they had fallen, their dark winter uniforms stark against the white snow. But it was not the tactical situation that had captured Hoffman's attention. It was something far more immediate and practical. "Look at their feet," Hoffman said quietly, pointing toward the nearest Soviet position. Muller raised his field glasses and focused on the fallen enemy soldiers. What he saw made him lower the glasses and look again with his naked eyes, certain that the cold had created some kind of optical illusion. Every Soviet soldier wore boots that were completely different from anything the German forces had seen. These were not leather boots like their own, but what appeared to be felt boots of enormous size, rising nearly to the knee. Even from a distance, it was clear that these boots were designed specifically for winter warfare in a way that German equipment was not. "Valenki," Richter said suddenly, his voice filled with recognition. "Russian felt boots. I have heard of them but never seen them." As they moved closer to examine the Soviet positions, the differences became even more pronounced. While the German soldiers struggled to maintain footing on the icy ground, the evidence around the Soviet positions showed that their forces had moved with ease and confidence across the same terrain. Weber knelt beside the first Soviet soldier they encountered, a young man who could not have been more than 20 years old. With careful respect for the fallen enemy, Weber examined the boots that had protected this soldier's feet far better than German equipment protected their own. The boots were massive by German standards, constructed from pressed felt that created an insulating layer of air while remaining completely waterproof. The soles were made from leather that had been treated to remain flexible in extreme cold, with a tread pattern designed specifically for snow and ice traction. Most remarkably, the boots were sized to accommodate thick wool socks and still allow for circulation that would prevent frostbite. "Look at this construction," Weber said, his engineer's mind immediately grasping the superior design principles. "These boots are engineered for this climate. The felt provides insulation without the weight of leather, the size allows for proper blood circulation, and the sole remains flexible even in extreme cold." Muller knelt beside another Soviet soldier and examined his equipment more broadly. The difference extended beyond just footwear. This soldier's winter uniform consisted of multiple layers designed to trap warm air while allowing moisture to escape. His gloves were oversized mittens that preserved finger warmth while maintaining dexterity. Even his helmet had been designed with winter warfare in mind, featuring ear flaps and a liner that provided protection against wind and cold. "This soldier is equipped for winter warfare," Muller observed. "Every piece of his equipment has been designed specifically for these conditions." The contrast with their own equipment became painfully obvious as they continued their examination. The German soldiers wore uniforms designed for the moderate climates of Western Europe. Their leather boots, while beautifully crafted and durable in normal conditions, became brittle and restrictive in extreme cold. Their gloves, thin and form-fitting, provided little insulation against Arctic temperatures. Richter, drawing on his experience as a cobbler, examined the construction of the Soviet boots with professional interest. "These boots could be produced quickly and cheaply," he observed. "Felt is easier to work with than leather, requires less skilled craftsmanship, and provides superior insulation. The design is brilliant in its simplicity." As they completed their reconnaissance and prepared to return to their positions, each German soldier carried with him a growing understanding of the industrial and logistical superiority of their opponents. The Soviet Union had not merely prepared for winter warfare. They had designed their entire military equipment philosophy around the assumption that conflict would occur in the harshest possible conditions. On the return journey through the snow-covered forest, the inadequacies of German equipment became even more apparent. Müller's feet had lost all sensation below the ankles, and he could only tell if he was still walking by watching his legs move. Weber stumbled repeatedly as his leather boots slipped on ice that Soviet boots would have gripped easily. Back in their defensive positions, the men of the patrol gathered in a supply bunker where they could speak freely without being overheard by other soldiers who had not witnessed what they had seen. "We need to write a detailed report on Soviet winter equipment," Weber said, pulling out a notebook and pencil. "Our high command needs to understand the extent of our equipment disadvantage." But even as Weber began documenting their observations, each man understood that such a report would change nothing for them personally. They would continue wearing inadequate boots, inadequate uniforms, and inadequate gloves because the German industrial system had not anticipated the need for such specialized equipment. Hoffmann, as section leader, faced the difficult task of maintaining morale while acknowledging the reality of their situation. "What we observe today stays within this group," he said firmly, "but each of you needs to understand that our survival depends on recognizing the limitations of our equipment and adapting accordingly." Over the following days, word of superior Soviet winter equipment spread through the German lines in whispered conversations and shared observations. Soldiers who had previously attributed Russian winter effectiveness to familiarity with cold climates began to understand that superior equipment played an equally important role. Müller found himself studying his own boots with new understanding. The leather that had seemed so substantial and well-crafted now appeared inadequate and poorly designed for their current environment. The metal studs that had provided traction on European roads now conducted cold directly to his feet and created ice formations that made walking treacherous. More troubling than the immediate discomfort was the growing realization of what superior equipment represented. The Soviet Union had prepared for winter warfare, not just with clothing and boots, but with an entire industrial philosophy that assumed conflict would occur under the most challenging possible conditions. Weber, in his continuing letters to his wife, tried to articulate this growing understanding. "The Russian boots, we observed, represent more than just better footwear," he wrote. "They represent an entire approach to warfare that assumes the worst possible conditions and prepares accordingly. Our approach assumed the best possible conditions and hoped they would continue." As December progressed and the cold intensified, the consequences of inadequate equipment became increasingly severe. Medical reports from German field hospitals documented a sharp increase in frostbite cases, almost all involving extremities that had been inadequately protected by standard equipment. Richter, with his cobbler's understanding of footwear construction, attempted to modify his own boots using materials salvaged from abandoned positions. He stuffed them with rags and paper to improve insulation, wrapped them in strips of cloth to improve warmth retention, and even experimented with replacing the metal studs with wood to reduce cold conduction. These improvised modifications provided some improvement, but they also highlighted the fundamental design flaws of equipment that had been created without consideration for extreme winter conditions. The psychological impact of understanding their equipment disadvantage proved as challenging as the physical discomfort. Soldiers who had begun the campaign with confidence in German industrial superiority now found themselves envying the practical wisdom of Soviet equipment designers. Müller, during a quiet moment in the trench, examined the toes of his boots and noticed that the leather had begun to crack from repeated freezing and thawing. These cracks would only worsen as winter progressed, eventually leading to complete boot failure at the moment when functional footwear would be most critical for survival. "Look at this deterioration," he said to Richter, showing the developing cracks. "These boots are not designed for this type of stress. They are failing because the materials and construction were never intended for prolonged exposure to extreme cold." Richter nodded grimly. "In my shop in Bavaria, I would never use this leather for winter boots. It lacks the oils and treatment necessary for cold weather flexibility, but this is what our army selected for all conditions." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a supply runner, carrying mail from home and rations for the evening meal. Among the letters was one for Weber from his wife, responding to his descriptions of their equipment challenges. "My husband writes about inadequate boots and uniforms," she had written, "but our newspapers report that German soldiers are the best equipped in the world. How can both of these things be true?" Weber read the letter aloud to his comrades, and the irony was not lost on any of them. While propaganda at home celebrated German industrial might and superior equipment, the reality in the field revealed a military that had been unprepared for the specific challenges of winter warfare. "The truth," Weber said, folding the letter carefully, "is that superior equipment is not about quality craftsmanship or expensive materials. It is about designing equipment for the conditions where it will actually be used." This understanding deepened as they encountered more evidence of Soviet preparation for winter warfare. Captured supply documents revealed that Soviet forces had been issued multiple types of boots for different winter conditions, specialized clothing for extreme cold operations, and even equipment designed specifically for maintaining weapons functionality in sub-zero temperatures. German forces, by contrast, had received summer uniforms supplemented by woolen overcoats that provided minimal protection against wind and moisture. Their boots, while excellent for parade grounds and moderate climates, became liabilities in conditions where survival depended on maintaining circulation and warmth in extremities. The realization extended beyond personal discomfort to broader strategic implications. If German forces were inadequately equipped for winter warfare, how could they maintain offensive operations against an enemy that was not only numerically superior, but also better prepared for the conditions? Müller, during his watch duties, found himself observing Soviet positions through field glasses and noting the confidence with which enemy soldiers moved across snow and ice. Where German forces struggled to maintain footing and mobility, Soviet soldiers appeared to move with the same ease they would demonstrate on dry ground. "They are not just accustomed to winter," he observed to Weber. "They are equipped for winter warfare in ways we are not. Every piece of their equipment assumes harsh conditions, while our equipment assumes favorable conditions." This distinction became increasingly important as winter deepened, and German forces found themselves not just fighting the Red Army, but fighting the environment itself with inadequate tools for survival. The boots that had once seemed adequate now represented a fundamental failure of planning and preparation. Each morning, soldiers forced swollen and frostbitten feet into leather boots that had become rigid shells, knowing that the day's activities would bring further injury to extremities that could not be properly protected. Weber's engineering background led him to calculate the broader implications of their equipment disadvantage. If each soldier spends additional energy compensating for inadequate equipment, he reasoned, then our entire force operates at reduced efficiency compared to properly equipped opponents. This reduced efficiency manifested in slower movement, increased fatigue, higher injury rates, and decreased combat effectiveness. Soldiers spent energy maintaining warmth and circulation that could have been used for tactical operations. As January 1942 began, the contrast between German and Soviet winter equipment had become undeniable. German soldiers, despite their training and courage, found themselves systematically disadvantaged by equipment that had been designed for conflicts that bore no resemblance to their current reality. The stolen Soviet boots that some soldiers had managed to acquire became precious possessions, traded and shared among comrades who understood that survival might depend on footwear designed for the conditions they faced. Hoffmann, in his reports to higher command, attempted to document the equipment crisis his men faced. But these reports, when they reached staff officers working in heated quarters far from the front lines, often received responses that emphasized the need to make do with available equipment rather than acknowledging systemic design failures. The growing understanding of Soviet equipment superiority forced a fundamental re-evaluation of assumptions about German industrial capability. Soldiers who had begun the campaign believing in the superiority of German engineering now understood that superior engineering meant designing equipment for actual conditions rather than ideal conditions. Müller, examining his feet during a brief respite from duty, noticed that 2 of his toes had developed the telltale white appearance of serious frostbite. The inadequate boots that were supposed to protect his feet had instead become contributors to injury that would affect him for the rest of his life. "These boots are not just inadequate," he said to his comrades. "They are actively harmful under these conditions. The design that works in normal climates becomes dangerous in extreme cold." This realization extended to other equipment as well. Gloves that provided dexterity in moderate temperatures became useless in extreme cold. Uniforms that offered comfort in temperate climates provided insufficient insulation against Arctic conditions. The psychological impact of this understanding proved as significant as the physical consequences. Soldiers who had trusted their equipment to protect them now understood that survival required constant vigilance against the very gear they had been issued. As February approached, bringing with it the promise of even colder temperatures, German forces faced the prospect of continuing operations with equipment that had proven systematically inadequate for their environment. The Soviet boots that had initially seemed merely different now represented a completely different philosophy of military preparation. Where German equipment assumed favorable conditions and provided solutions for ideal circumstances, Soviet equipment assumed harsh conditions and provided solutions for worst-case scenarios. Weber, in what would be his final letter home, attempted to articulate the broader lessons of their equipment crisis. "Superior military equipment," he wrote, "is not equipment that performs best under optimal conditions. It is equipment that continues to function when conditions become impossible." This distinction had become the difference between military forces that could maintain effectiveness throughout a Russian winter and forces that found themselves fighting not just an enemy army, but their own inadequate preparation for the environment where the conflict was taking place. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.